Hi, so I was just going to do a quick video regarding the process of baking, specifically in reference to this tweet here. And I wanted to talk about how to get this sort of result, as shown off great by Maria here, how to get these fake details in a normal map, which you can put onto a low poly mesh, which is super important for areas like game development, like I mentioned down here. So I already explained in a rudimentary way the principle of a normal map, so I'm not going to go over it again here, but just basically for anyone who might come later, it's just a texture that shows the direction of a face, and it can do so at the resolution of a texture without needing more polygons. So we'll see that in action in just a second. So let's go into Blender quickly. I'm going to make a very simple example. So I'm just going to have a plane here, and I'm going to subdivide it a lot. Just get something really high poly here. Alright, that seems enough. And then I'm just going to sculpt some shapes on this, right? There we go. Alright, so there's some shapes. I'm just going to shade that smooth. So there we go. There are some shapes. Now, there are a lot of polygons here, so what if we wanted to get the illusion of this shape, but with something really low poly? So for the sake of this argument, I'm just going to get a single plane, and I'm going to move it up so that it sits fully above our other mesh, just like that, so it's not clipping through. Now, the process of baking is only available in cycles because it requires ray tracing, so you'll need to go to your render engine and switch it over to cycles for the important settings to show up. If you have a GPU that can run cycles, I highly recommend using it. And under your render settings, you're going to want to turn your max samples down a bit. For my case, I'm literally going to turn it down to 1. Just for the sake of speed. If you want more quality, you can turn it up a little bit, but the baking process does not generally need a large number of samples. So let's just scroll down here, and you can see that there's a tab, a drop down here that says Bake. So let's press that and open that up. There are a couple of options here. The main one we're going to look at is Bake Type Combined in this case. Now, I have personally never used combined baking, so we're going to switch this. You can see all the different options of things we can bake here. I'm going to switch this to normal because we want to bake the normal into a normal map. Now, to get it to understand that we want to bake from one object to another, you're going to want to check Selected to Active. And click that. You can open this up, and we'll get to these things later, mostly things like cage and extrusion, but I do want to talk about max ray distance very quickly. So let's just talk about how baking works quickly. Essentially, the texture is put on to the model, and then from each pixel of the texture, a ray cast is sent in the direction opposite to the surface's normal, which is this. So you invert that by 1, and then from each pixel of the texture, you do a little ray cast that goes downwards. And in this case, that ray cast is going to hit this other object. And once it hits the object, it's going to sample the normal that it finds and write it back to the pixel here, and then repeat the process for the whole texture. So our max ray distance is asking how far should the ray be able to travel, and this is important to get this right, because if you get it wrong, then the ray might never find the mesh you're after. So if we set it something very small, the ray might only go down this far, and it will hit nothing, and so it'll write nothing back to the texture, and that's obviously bad. So in my case, I'm just going to set the ray distance something really big, 0.5 meters. You probably won't really use something this large in most cases, but for the sake of this, it will work, and it'll make sure we don't get any errors. So let's do a bake quickly. The first thing we need to do is go into our shading tab and create a texture to bake to. So let's just open up our shading tab quickly. I'm just going to close this timeline. Now I'm just going to create a new material. This is on our low poly mesh, not our high poly one. That is important. And in here, I'm going to create an image texture node, and I'm going to hit the plus button for new texture. I'm going to call this tutorial. And we can specify a resolution here. I'm just going to leave this at 1K. Now, because a normal map is only an RGB texture, we don't need the alpha channel. So I'm going to uncheck that, and all the rest of these options are fine. So we click New Image. Now, we can't actually see our image, which is a bit annoying. So I'm going to pull open by just going to the corner here and dragging out a new window. And I'm going to switch with this button up here at the top left. I'm going to switch to the image editor. And then up here, I'm going to select our tutorial normal image. There we go. Now we can view it. Now there's nothing to see yet. That's because we haven't done the bake. So let's do that. Let's go back to our render settings up here and down to the bake section. And you can see that, as again, like we checked before, this is selected to active. So the active object is the object you've most recently selected in the viewport. So if I make a few objects here, and then I select one, then shift select the next, you can see the one I just recently selected has a yellow outline, whereas the other one has red. The yellow outlined one is the active object. If I select another, you can see the active object changes, and the other two have their red outlines. So it's going to bake selected to active. We need to select what we want to bake from. We want to bake the detail from this high poly mesh to the low poly mesh. So we select that second, and that's going to make sure that our low poly mesh has the yellow outline and is the active object. After we've done that, we're ready to bake. So let's just hit bake here and just give this a second. And there you go. You can see that we now have a normal map. We have the details in face direction from this super high poly mesh transferred into a simple texture. So let's give this a try out. Let's try this out. So first of all, we need another node. We need a normal map node right here. We can plug this into the normal of our principled BSDF shader. Now, if you were to plug this texture in just directly like this, you will run into a few issues, but they can all be fixed through one simple thing, and this is super important. You need to change the color space. You'll notice the color space is grayed out. That's because we need to save our image first. The way Blender works is using links for external files rather than copying any assets you use to the Blender file itself. This helps reduce space on your computer, but the downside is that when you create a texture, you have to save it somewhere external on your computer, outside the Blender file. So we just go up here to Image, Save. I'm just going to save it on my desktop. Tutorial normal.png, that's fine. Now that's saved, we can now adjust things like the color space. And at the moment it's set to sRGB, which is not what we want, because sRGB is designed to be interpreted as a visual color. We're not interpreting it that, we're interpreting this as pure vectors to use for direction. So you want to switch sRGB to non-color. This is very important. If you're running into any issues, just check that your normal maps are set to non-color. As soon as you set that, it will become correct. All right, now let's test this out a bit. I'm just going to go into rendered mode, and I'm going to grab a light. Normal maps themselves will also work just fine in Eevee. It's just that the baking process needs to be in cycles. So let's just look at this. You can see that despite the fact that our plane is completely flat in terms of geometry, the lighting now mimics that of the other plane. Let's pull, excuse the low battery. Let's pull out our other plane here, and let's have a look. You can see that they look very similar. You'll notice one difference, that is that the plane with actual geometry extending has shadows, whereas cast shadows, these shadows right here. Whereas the one with just the normal map doesn't, it only shows the shading. This is one of the limitations of normal maps, that because it's not actually an actual geometric displacement, things like shadow maps won't adjust to it. So that's one of the limitations. But there you go. So there's a simple bake. All right, now let's try something a little bit more complicated. I'm just going to reuse this same texture we were using before, and I'm going to make a... let's use a sphere this time, because I think that'd be interesting. I'm going to use an icosphere, and I'm just going to set the resolution to something really high for the sake of demonstration. And then let's just sculpt some stuff on it, just like we did before. just to give us something to see once we've completed the bake. Alright, so there's something. We've got this kind of lumpy sphere now, and now let's get a low poly mesh to bake it to. I'm going to use a UV sphere for this, because I think that will be good, and I'm going to even reduce... I'll leave this. I'll leave the resolution as it is. So there's our low poly mesh. I'll just shade that smooth as well. So let's just apply that material to our low poly mesh here, the material we were using before with our texture setup. And now let's try a bake. So I'll select first the high poly mesh, then I'll hold shift, select the low poly mesh, so it's the active object, and then let's try baking again. Alright, now let's look at our image, because we seem to have a bit of an issue here, as you can see, which is that most of it hasn't been captured. Let's have a little look at this. Let's get out of light and have a look at what we've got here. So you can see that there are parts where we've got a bit of normal map detail, but they're not very strong. They're not really properly there. It's very odd. There are patches where it works, patches where it hasn't. And that is because of one simple issue. So let's look at that quickly. Like I said before, when doing a bake, the ray cast from the pixel is cast in the opposite direction to the normal of the face it is coming from. So if our low poly mesh has a face that has an upwards facing normal, then the ray from each pixel is going to go opposite to that. So in our case, our low poly mesh right here has all its normals facing outward, which means the rays from it are going to go downward or inward like that. And you can see the problem already, which is that a lot of our high poly mesh is actually outside the low poly mesh. So it's just missing half of it. The only parts it's capturing are these parts, because they're the only parts it can hit. So we need to expand this low poly mesh to go around the high poly one. Now you could do that by going in here and scaling, which is not the best way, because if you have a funny shape like this, scaling won't do the right thing. It'll move it all symmetrically and all in a uniform way. So you don't want to scale. What we want to do is go into here in our bake settings, and we want to look at the extrusion property right here. Unfortunately, this is not visualized when you change it, but I'll just explain quickly. What it does is it extrudes, or not extrudes, but pushes each face out along its normal, like this, basically, which is exactly what we need, because we want this mesh to go around our other one, so everything else is inside it. So let's increase this to 0.25. I reckon that will probably be enough. And now let's try to bake again. High poly mesh first, then shift select low poly mesh, hit bake. There you go. We have a successful texture bake. If your texture isn't appearing here, it's not changing when you hit bake, make sure you have your image texture actually selected. I forgot to mention this earlier, I apologize. Make sure you have your texture node selected. That way Blender will know what texture to bake to. Okay, so there you go. We have a successful normal map. Let's look at that in rendered mode. I'll just increase the intensity of this light a little bit, make it a little easier to see. So there you go, you can see that all that detail has been transferred onto our low poly mesh. We now have all those nice ripples without nearly the same poly count, not even close to the same poly count. So yeah, that's the idea of baking. Alright, a couple of other issues you might run into. If you do a texture bake, like I've done here with this high poly plane to this low poly one, and your normal map looks all yellowy, then it is wrong. Your normal map should always look blue. So what's gone wrong here is that we've gotten one of the normals the wrong way round. To see and check, you just go up to your little overlays panel right here, open it up and check face orientation. And we can see the problem. The outside faces should always appear blue. If they appear red, then we've got to face the wrong way. So to fix this, we go into our mesh, into edit mode, just by pressing tab or edit mode up here. And then we press Shift and N. So you press Shift N. And that's going to recalculate our normals. In this case, it hasn't fixed it. Sometimes it will. But if it's still wrong, then you just need to check this box that says inside, and that will make sure it's the correct way around. So you want both faces to be blue when looking at them from the correct direction. Now, if we rebake, our normal map is correct. So you will sometimes run into issues like that, but they're easy enough to fix. Normal maps are incredibly powerful. So to give an example quickly of where one can be used, I've got these two rock models here which I'm using, and one of them is extremely high poly. It keeps lagging my computer every time I try to open it. It is 5 million triangles. It is a huge mesh, and it contains a crazy amount of detail for all these little bumps and whatnot. And then this mesh right here is a super low poly one. This only has 7,000 triangles, and you can see the mesh here. But yet you can see that it carries over so much of the detail that they look almost exactly the same. You can barely tell from this distance which one is the high poly one, which one is the low poly one. And that's the power of normal maps. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. Not particularly in depth. Also worth mentioning that Blender's baking tools are notoriously lackluster. They do work, they're practical enough, but they're not the best in the industry by far. If you want a more professional baking solution, you'll probably want to go somewhere like Marmoset Toolbag, which I'm pretty sure is the professional baking software of choice for many professionals. But it's not free, and I have no clue how to use it, so I really can't help you with that one. All I know is that it is known for being better for baking than Blender is. And I'm pretty sure you can also bake in tools like Substance Painter, but again, that's very expensive from Autodesk, so Blender is fine. But I do hope they improve their baking tools in future updates.